Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. And in a way, this program recorded 3 days after Barack Obama was elected President of the United States by both very substantial electoral college and popular votes, is a continuation of an open mind conversation we brought you 6 months ago. That, of course, was somewhat before our economy, and then the world's too, seemed in meltdown, with housing markets in dizzy decline, stock markets everywhere in total disarray, and our banking structure geared for unprecedented governmental involvement. Yet our program's warning was clear. For my guest then, and again today, Peter G. Peterson, entrepreneur, banker, industrialist, philanthropist, former Secretary of Commerce, has long since warned that America is running on empty, that wonderfully evocative book title he had used some time back. And to match his words with deeds, my guest had just created the Peter G. Peterson Foundation with $1 billion of his own making, hoping that it might convince Americans, young and old alike, that we and our government can't any of us really over time spend more than we make, saving little or nothing, that we can't any longer sustain ourselves on an unsustainable path, that we can't keep running on empty. To be sure, lest I seem then to be pressing him into partisanship in an already overheated presidential campaign year, I didn't then ask Pete Peterson about party platforms or pledges or candidates. But now we've cast our votes, and I feel free to ask Pete Peterson what he believes President-elect Obama must do now. What's my guest's own agenda for America, and appropriately for the new Peterson Foundation? What do you recommend, Pete?
Well, let's break that down to the short term and the long term. It's perfectly obvious that the economic crisis is the overwhelming problem today, and any president would have to address that. I would think that the elements of the appropriate program would include the following. First of all, it is very important that we motivate the whole world to do something. This is a global recession, and for a lot of reasons we can discuss, I happen to think it's going to be much longer and deeper than most recessions are. Since it's global, it should take coordinated global action. So I would have thought one of the early steps should be to try to get the rest of the developed nations in the world to engage in some stimulus, some fiscal stimulus to their economies, so that we stimulate the world economy and not just ours. Secondly, I think it's important to look at the current situation and try to understand what the elements of the problem are. It's my theory that this will likely be a consumer-led or a consumption-led recession. Consumption is over 70% of this economy, and I have several reasons for believing, and today's retail sales numbers would seem to support that, and auto sales, that the consumer is going to, left alone, would be inclined to spend much less. Why? Well, as you pointed out, we have no savings. We have a zero savings rate. Secondly, we are borrowing at the consumer level at historic levels. Third, much of the spending that we've been doing over the last 7-8 years has been stimulated by people refinancing their houses because the value of the houses were going up, and with American optimism we assumed they'd go up forever. The houses were heavily leveraged. Many of them had very little money down or no money down in some cases, so they went for it. But now their net worth, the house used to account for about 2/3 of the net worth of most homeowners, has fallen dramatically. So people are far less wealthy than they used to be. So spending your wealth, or the wealth effect, as the economists used to call it, is far less likely. Credit card debt is at $1 trillion, and it is very high level. And something like 30% of credit card debt today are subprime type credit holders. In other words, quite risky. So I think we're facing a recession that will be led heavily by the consumer. Now, that was particularly true for product categories that require financing, because, as I'm sure you must know, lending has almost frozen. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, while the broad thrust of what was done recently was appropriate, namely putting capital in banks, the theory, Dick, was the following: that banks tend to lend, they leverage their equity about 10-to-1 generally. And the theory was that if you gave banks capital, it would have a multiplier effect on lending. Unfortunately, unlike France, which tied lending requirements to the capital. Officially. There were no lending requirements here. And early on, and I hope this changes, some of the biggest banks have indicated they don't intend to increase lending. Now, lending is extremely important to the growth of this economy. And experts who know a lot more than I do tell me that they're expecting lending at the current rate to only go up about 1%, whereas normally it goes up 9%. That alone could result in a reduction in the GDP of 1.5% to 2%. So any of the products that require financing, like autos, like durables, and other products, are likely to be in a pretty tough period. So what do you do about all this is the issue, aside from a global, program. There are only a few things you can do at this point. Number one, you can put more money in the hands of people that really need it, for example, by extending the unemployment type revenues for individuals. You can put it in infrastructure, and Lord knows our infrastructure is in tough shape. That tends to promote jobs.
By infrastructure, you mean roads?
Highways and buildings of various types and construction. And that tends to result quickly into jobs, because you obviously have to hire people to build whatever you're building. A new element in this whole picture, because remember that the states and the cities also have some of these long-term pension programs that you and I have discussed. And most of them were pretty well funded. However, with the stock market down 40-50%, their funds have dropped dramatically. And for that reason, and for the reason of recessions, and here in New York, we're very much aware that a lot of the revenues of the city of New York comes from Wall Street, and it's just perfectly obvious that the revenues are going to fall dramatically. So I would not be surprised to see some money go directly to states and cities. Now, among the most controversial steps, in my opinion, will be what to do about specific companies. And as you know, the auto companies are in Washington right now. And that's going to present some rather interesting policy questions. The most obvious being, if you're going to help the auto industry, why don't you help the appliance industry?
Pete, what's your answer to that question?
Well, I think it's an immensely tough one, and it'll be solved largely politically, I would guess, because there's so many jobs involved in the auto industry. And it's part of the program of the environment of getting cars built that are not only more fuel efficient, but are more environmentally friendly than they are now.
So they have a leg up in Detroit.
They do. Now, the underlying problem that caused this horrible meltdown, as you will recall, was the drop in housing prices. And they've fallen 20%. And that, of course, made all of these mortgage-related securities worth much less and caused these huge losses. It is now predicted by some experts that housing prices have still another 10 to 15% to fall, which has all of these effects I just mentioned on the net worth and people's ability to get home equity loans and all that sort of thing. So I would expect another part of the package to try to do something to limit foreclosures, because a lot of foreclosures have two effects. There's a direct effect that we've already covered, but there's a psychological effect. It has a very negative effect on confidence. So I would expect that to also be part of the program. Now, there are half a dozen ways of doing that. You can say you can't foreclose, or you can do what was suggested during the campaign by several of the candidates. But don't be surprised if there's something in there that tries to stabilize housing prices. Because if housing prices were to fall another 10 or 15%, it would greatly aggravate our domestic problem.
What's your prediction that these changes will be made?
I think you're going to see a big package of changes, and people are going to forget their typical concerns about deficits. I've been concerned about deficits for some time, but basically the long-term picture. Short-term, we're now facing a number that could be well around $1 trillion. Now, that's 1,000 billion dollars. You remember Everett Dirksen said $1 billion here and $1 billion there?
Begins to add up.
1,000 billion here and 1,000 billion there, and it's real money. But I think the concerns about the economy, and this morning they reported 240,000 job loss in October, 6.5% unemployment rate, rising very rapidly. I think you're going to see a big package of stimulus measures.
Pete, a year ago, 6 months ago, would you have expected Pete Peterson to be saying these things?
Well, sometimes it's better to be dumb lucky, than smart. I got concerned, frankly, about, at the time the Blackstone offering went public, which is most of the money that I'm using for my foundation. And I took a look at the housing picture, and my gut started churning. We had the following set of things going on in the housing market. Housing prices had gone up enormously, as you know, 10%, even up to 15%. People were taking out these loans that were no money down, adjustable rate. And then I looked at the savings rates, and they were falling and falling and falling. Then I looked at the borrowing levels, and they were at historic, kind of levels. And I said to myself, what if housing prices don't go up? And what if people are stuck with these multi-trillion dollars worth of these mortgage assets, which are tied to the value of houses. So I was lucky enough to take this money and put the vast majority of it in Treasury bills. So I've been quite...
Excuse me. Lucky isn't the word. Smart is the word.
Well, I don't know about that. But no, I've been concerned for about a year that we were in fantasy land. And while the foundation is overwhelmingly concerned with not the subprime crisis, but what we call avoiding the super subprime crisis, which are the long-term liabilities. Dave Walker, who's a great guy that runs the foundation as Comptroller General of the United States, I asked if he could put together what the magnitude is of all of the government liabilities, and much more important, the unfunded promises that we've made that are off the books. You know, they're kind of hidden from view. You know, all you hear about now is that we have $10 trillion worth of public debt. The actual total of liabilities and unfunded promises of Social Security and Medicare and so on are a stunning $53 trillion. That's 3 or 4 times the whole gross domestic product of the United States. You couldn't possibly borrow that much money if you tried. If you had to raise taxes on our children and their generation, they'd have to double, which is unthinkable politically, economically, morally. So the second part of what I hope this next president, to return to your original question, is not get so preoccupied with the short problem that we let an incipient super subprime crisis, namely these unfunded promises that are now about to hit us because the boomers, 78 million strong, twice as many as the previous generation, are now beginning to retire in numbers. So it would be, how do you meet the short-term problems, emergencies, which we must, and start planning for the long term?
Let me ask you, though, whether you find at least on a psychological, well, let's say a psychological, a philosophical, a political science level, the difficulty of carrying those two buckets at the same time. When we've spoken before, when you wrote Running on Empty, it was so important to hear Pete Peterson talk about what we must do now to avoid where we are now. Can you do both? Can the foundation recognize what is needed today and what is needed for the meta future at the same time?
Well, you're too courteous and kind to state the question the way some people state it, which is, Peterson, have you lost your mind? Aren't you being terribly presumptuous? Aren't you being foolhardy to think you can tackle the long-term issues? And I was presumably educated at the University of Chicago, and George Stigler, a Nobel Prize winner, was one of my professors. And he said one day, if you have no alternative, you have no problem. And I thought a bit about that, Dick. And I looked out to next 10 years or 15 years. I have 5 kids and 9 grandchildren. And I said to myself, how am I going to feel on my deathbed or wherever I am? Or how would I feel looking back, knowing that these problems are extremely serious and do nothing about them? And wouldn't that be a terrible feeling to have? So I don't think, I have an alternative. Now, there's some reason to be optimistic. The first is that I think the subprime crisis has awakened Americans to the fact that you can't keep forgetting and denying the future indefinitely. And I'm now stopped by people on the street saying, are you Pete Peterson? By God, you were right. We should have, done something about these problems. So what we're proposing, because it's totally unrealistic to think that a president is going to take on all these short-term problems and also start talking to people about Social Security and Medicare and saving more and doing all those things, is that we think he should appoint a special kind of bipartisan commission, because this problem will never be solved except with presidential leadership and bipartisanship. And everything must be on the table. We have now this ideological divide, where the Democrats are typically characterized as they never want to reduce benefits or cut spending, and the Republicans are characterized they won't consider any tax increases. Well, the truth of the matter is that while most of what we're going to have to do is going to be through benefit reductions that still honor the safety net for the people that really need them, but reduce them for the rest of us, like you and me, if I may say so. And propose a commission where everything is on the table, made up of highly prestigious people, including people like Paul Volcker, and Bob Rubin, who are kind of transcend the partisan, and have them come up with recommendations on what to do about these programs, what to do about revenues, what to do about how to increase savings, which I think is absolutely central, and handle it the way we now have military base closings, and which, as you may recall, if you try to close one or two at a time, the senator from that particular district raises hell and you can't do it. So they have to vote on the whole package. Having agreed in general, they want to discuss. They all agree on the need for closing some bases. Now, the issue that I worry the most that could trigger a crisis are the huge amounts of our balance payments and trade deficits and our savings deficit. And the amounts of money that we're borrowing now from abroad are just totally unsustainable. There's a Peterson Institute in Washington, poorly named, of international economics, and I'm now having them do projections of what this country looks like in 10 years if we continue borrowing this much money, from the Chinese and the Japanese and the Mideast and so forth. And it's a totally unthinkable position. So I keep mentioning savings. In the old days, Dick, we used to rationalize our occasional fiscal irresponsibility moves by saying we owe it to ourselves. Well, we don't owe it to ourselves anymore because we aren't saving anything. We owe it to foreigners. And that brings about huge economic risks. And what are the economic risks? That at some point these people lose confidence in America and decide they're not going to finance these deficits anymore. And it isn't that they'd have to dump of all what they had. If they just decided not to finance the current ones, it would raise hell with us. It could also involve geopolitical risks. You and I are old enough to remember Dwight Eisenhower. And during that period of time, you may remember, the British wanted to make, and did make, a military move on the Suez Canal. We held a lot of British pound securities. And we quietly got a hold of the Brit and say, we strongly object to this. And I hope you don't put us in a position, but we're prepared to do it. We're prepared to dump these securities, which would have had a devastating effect on the British economy.
Who's in the position to do that to us?
Well, the Chinese could do it. The Mideast could do it. Anybody could do it. And I was on a program last night with Madeleine Albright, and I was saying to her, the foreign policy people have to get integrated with the economic people and start thinking about the political risks that are involved in being this dependent on foreign capital. So that commission should deal with what I consider to be a fundamental problem in America. How do we get people to save more? Because we've been brought up, that we can have it all and we can have it now and we're entitled and we're boomers, and we don't have to save and all that sort of thing.
Fact of the matter is, Pete, you and I were brought up to believe to the opposite, that we had to save. Unfortunately, we've brought up new generations. Obviously, we've taught them they didn't have to. We have a minute left. Let me just ask you whether you think that the conduct of the late political campaign indicates that there is going to be a willingness for us to come together to do what you think we must do.
Well, the politics are such that Dave Walker and I met with the leaders of the Senate and House, and we were on the one hand very happy to hear that they weren't denying the problems we were talking about. They said, you guys couldn't be more right. They are huge and we got to do something. But the politics are terminal. The politics are toxic. And asking people to give up something, in our opinion, is suicide, and people don't like to commit suicide.
That was before Election Day.
That was before election. What I think now is with a president with a big mandate, having gone through the subprime crisis, if we could get this put together in a bipartisan way and let this commission function for 6 months or so while we work out these other things. And then later, when the country has some confidence again, we start tackling the long-term problems. That is, to me, the best scenario possible.
Pete Peterson, as my mother would have said, from your lips to God's ears, or to the politicians' ears. Thank you so much for joining me again. It's not a pleasant topic in a sense, but you still bring to it an optimism and must-do that I particularly appreciate.
Thank you, Dick, very much.
And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. For transcripts of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.